I trust you can hear me and see me.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm here along with my colleagues. Um, Apart from me, all of who are based in India. And we today will host a discussion, participate in discussion on issues of certainty in qualitative research, qualitative psychology, especially as practiced in the Indian context. The idea for this, I suppose, came from a sense of dissatisfaction, um, even disappointment with the tools, um, possibilities for interpretation analysis that qualitative psychology currently offers for a setting like India. So we have speakers who will speak to these concerns, especially when working within what has been broadly understood as qualitative psychology does not seem to be able to engage with issues for marginalized communities and marginalized individuals in the Indian context. So that's where we're coming from, and I'm frantically scrolling to see if the other colleagues have joined the link. Um, but let me introduce them. So we have Professor Rachna Johri, who's from the Ambedkar University, Delhi. She's a professor of psychotherapy and clinical research. She's a director for the Center for Psychotherapy and Clinical Research, and her focus is on um, issues for women primarily, issues for women in pregnancy. Her expertise is in urban studies, disability studies, and Muslim women. And today she will talk about situating qualitative psychology in the Indian context, where the notion of Indian culture as somehow unitary or simple limits the types of qualitative psychology and types of qualitative analyses that can be taken part. And she will speak from her position as a feminist psychologist. Next, we have Professor Shuba Ranganathan, who's from Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. She's the head of department and associate professor in liberal arts. While much of Shuba's work is in psychology, she also works in areas of anthropology and medicine in addressing issues of mental health. And today she'll discuss issues about conducting interdisciplinary research in psychology as it happens in India. Finally, we have Dr. Degi Verghese, who's just finished her PhD from the Department of Liberal Arts in Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. And Degi is interested in critical and analytical explorations of topics that are often not very researched in psychology. And her research deals with issues of critical psychology as applicable for women and issues for women. And today she'll talk to you about what it means to conduct qualitative psychological research on topics where context matters so much, but where using that context to illuminate issues for marginalized peoples is not readily given by qualitative psychology. So I see that I see my colleagues are here. So if so, give a brief introduction, Shubha, Degi. I don't see Rachna. So if Shubha, if you can start, I think we'll just wait till Rachna joins us.
Hi, thank you, Rahul, and thank you really very much for inviting me to be part of this roundtable discussion on the actual experience of doing qualitative and critical research in the Indian context. And as you know, some of these conversations have been long, going on since quite a while, and it's really good to sort of connect here on this platform. So I just heard from Rachna that she was having some tech issues in terms of connecting. You may just want to check with her, Rahul.
Yeah.
To just give a brief introduction about myself. I teach in the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, which is a premier technological institute. And my own background and training has been in clinical psychology, but my work at the moment sort of moves beyond psychology to also draw from a variety of fields such as anthropology, medical humanities, disability studies, gender studies, and so on. And I have been teaching and researching in IIT Hyderabad since about 10 years, working on topics related to subjectivity and meaning, particularly in the context of experiences around health and illness and gender. I've worked on a range of topics such as women's experiences around trance and possession in the context of their involvement in religious shrines or healing shrines. I've also looked at, what are the implications of religious shrines for community mental health service and delivery. And I've also been engaged in research around different aspects of gender. And currently I'm working on understanding people's experiences in engaging with different facets around disability, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities. Most of my work draws from, as I said, drawing from a variety of different methods and approaches, but a lot of it is ethnographic. And what I'll be talking about in my session is about, what are some of the challenges in terms of actually practicing interdisciplinary research, and what does that really have? What kind of implications does that have for the way in which we understand critical and qualitative research in psychology? So I see that Rachna is here, so I'm going to pause and let her introduce herself. Thanks, Rahul.
You're on mute, Rachna.
I'll just do that. Yeah, thank you, Shuba. Hi, Rahul, and hi, Devi. Glad to be here. Well, I'm Rachna Johri. I'm a professor at this new university, which has a fairly unconventional approach to psychology, which is called the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. I've basically trained largely as a positivist psychologist, but as I have said elsewhere, that two influences of feminism and psychoanalysis have sort of, turned me towards qualitative inquiry. And my work has been mostly in the area of gender. And in particular, I have worked on maternal subjectivity. And a lot of my interest has been actually on bringing the mother's voice in a domain where there has been much written about mothers without actually listening to their own experience of what it has been like to be mothers. But apart from that, I have also in recent years been interested in disability, and also on what might broadly be called the question of new subjectivities in a neoliberal India. So those have been some of my major interests. And of course, mental health remains always an abiding interest. And these have been the guiding fields, and these have been the areas in which I have been working. Thanks. And Deiki, now, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi everyone. My name is Daiji Varghese. I am a PhD student in the Department of Liberal Arts at IIT Hyderabad. So I'm very glad to be a part of this roundtable discussion. So my PhD's work is an ethnographic research of women's involvement in the Kudumbashree in Kerala, an Indian state. Kudumbashree is a community-based participatory program of women in neighborhood groups. I look at how being involved in the Kudumbashree shifts gender dynamics within the household and enables women to act in agential ways and push boundaries without disrupting the structures of patriarchy. My MPhil research was an online ethnography of gender talk in social media. I used discourse analysis and thematic analysis to understand the data within the larger socio-cultural context. For both my research, I gave utmost importance to understanding the data or narratives within the larger context. The methodological decisions were made to bring in the background and context into the forefront. Today, I would like to talk about the relevance of context in qualitative research. I talk about it from a student's perspective. Based on students' perspective, based on my research experience of doing ethnographic qualitative research on topics related to gender. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. So I'll just pick up from what Daiji was ended her point on, that there seems to be a common concern with context, and this is not just a concern that I think three of you have here. Similar kinds of conversations were had in the conference yesterday, and similar kinds of conversations were happening today as well. So it seems to be a running or a persistent issue for us as qualitative psychologists about how to deal with context. So I'm going to try and or I want you to tell all of us, and then open this discussion up by telling us. So Rachna, maybe we can start first about how it is that, let's say, context of discipline, right? Context of your work as bounded within psychology has been how have you navigated that that bind?
Right. Well, thank you, Rahul. I'd say it's been a difficult journey to navigate the relationship between psychology in particular, the way psychology has been defined. And as I was saying in my introduction, it's perhaps a generational issue, but the world in which I grew up, I was really trained to be a positivist psychologist. I learned statistics, I learned experimental psychology, I learned testing. And I think the closest I got to anything that might be called qualitative psychology as far as my training was concerned was really, case studies, what might be called, what were called case studies in those days, or, occasionally learning things like projective testing, right? But as you can imagine, the framework was fundamentally nomothetic, and the entire orientation was on finding universal essentials. And that was really what I learned was the purpose of psychology, occasionally moving away to thinking about specific individuals, where sometimes, one would break away from the quantitative tradition into the qualitative one. So as I've said, I think it was somewhat accidental that I got involved in qualitative psychology. And in fact, since you put the question in this way, I would say that I was perhaps from my university the first person to have done a PhD in qualitative psychology. And my PhD has all the effects of having been, a PhD, which came out of a struggle, to find a voice in an extremely positivist tradition. But one, of course, I have to grant it to my supervisor and my department that they were changing at that time. And and as a result, I did get the opportunity to study this question. So I think that's the first thing I want to say, that it's been a difficult journey. It's also been difficult in the sense and that even within what has been called qualitative psychology, there are a lot of voices that, while they engage with participants in a qualitative manner, when it comes to, in fact, producing the results, right, or actually making the analysis of the data that they have generated, there is a great deal of context sensitivity, and I will not take away from that. And I think that's also very true for a grounded theory and research, of which there is a lot in India. But it is the abiding tendency within psychology to want to have findings at the end. And I think that tendency to want to have findings, right, is something that has made my kind of research work, which I think tends to see itself as producing an alternative rendering or an alternative narrative of a story which has already existed culturally, right? I think that has still not found the kind of space that I would have liked it to find. And that has been one of the difficulties that I have faced. So I think I would be honest to say that my work has probably been better received by feminist psychologists specifically, and feminist social scientists in general, right, than by the discipline of psychology. However, I would also say that I'm really grateful for the emergence, and now it has been some time since that has happened, for this tradition, which is called, the two traditions I like to engage with are critical psychology and psychosocial studies. And both of these, in fact, try to bridge, and particularly psychosocial studies of the kind I like to work with, tries to bridge some aspects of Foucault's work on the production of subject positions through discourse, and the affective sort of ties of childhood, and how they go into the making of the subjective. So trying to put these two ends together to see the way in which, in fact, subjectivity is both highly biographical and personal, and at the same time, deeply embedded in the social realm, and that you cannot actually pull the two apart from each other. The psychosocial is, in fact, not, you cannot actually split it into the psychological and the social. Whatever you are working with is, in fact, the psycho and the social are mutually produced, mutually constitutive. So that's been really a bit of what my journey has been about. In spite of, it has, however, been very enriching for me personally to be able to break away from thinking of the individual as separate from the social, for thinking of the mind as separate from the body, so to be able to actually use frameworks which prevent these kinds of dualisms has been very important for me, and to be able to think of culture and the social as constantly growing, developing, and changing, right? So in fact, I think that's another very important aspect of the work I have engaged with. That is, one is to give a focus to marginal voices, because that's where I think you can hear the multiple strands, within which their subjectivity is located. So that's one thing which I think is very important. And to see that, it is when you hear marginal voices that you can actually see the voice which resists dominant culture as well. Yeah. And I think it is one of the tasks that we need to perform as psychologists, particularly if we do not want to keep on sort of reinstating the dominant voice of culture, and in fact be able to show how the subjective resists culture, the dominant aspects of culture, just as much as it is embedded within it. I mean, again, I do not think you can tear the two apart. In individual narratives, you will hear both, woven closely with each other. There'll be a part in my work with mothers of daughters, for example, which is a very difficult subject position to occupy in India. Which has a culture of North India, particularly, which has a culture of son preference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to have had many daughters meant that you could be seen as what in Hindi is called a banj, that is to be a barren woman, despite having 6 daughters, right? And yet these women were, at one level, they, replicated all the social norms about wanting to get their daughters married and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there were occasions, and particularly when I found that their subject positions as wives had somehow come under, attack, that it was paradoxically in those moments that their maternal subjective became more prominent, and they could in fact become, very resistant to the dominant norms of the social world. So to see the subjective as being woven together, right, within the various discourses, also meant to see that the social world in which these women were embedded was a changing world. So they would also talk about women's education. They would also talk about, seeing women wearing alternative types of clothing. They would also talk about women being able to seek employment just as much as they would speak about other aspects, which were more traditional and much, much more embedded.
Right.
I thought that this was an interesting, this has been an interesting aspect for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if Deji, if you felt something similar in doing research on issues that obviously intersect with a lot of work that Rachna was talking about. Did you also have to deal with and how did you deal with similar concerns of context, and especially in a context where when you're looking at women's issues, the possibility of them or their marginalization in many ways is a problem for us to investigate, and also is a problem for themselves. So, and how do those things or how do those issues come up for you in your research?
Yeah, so I started my PhD research with a broad research question to understand the changing social dynamics in the social landscape of Kerala. So I actually started this research by interviewing working women working in IT professions and beauty parlors. And one mistake that I did during that time was that I was directly asking them about their opinions on gender equality and feminism. That is how I approached to understand, the changing gender dynamics in the society. But after the data collection, I realized that the data is mostly about idealistic answers on equality and feminism without any context. And also I also realized that I approached the group, the participants, with an assumption that they would be invested in topics like equality and feminism and all. But I realized that they are more invested in on the day-to-day challenges of being a working woman. So that is when I understood the importance of studying a topic in a much more contextualized manner. And I shifted the focus of my research to, I decided to do a more ethnographic research, where I went to this production units where women in Kudumbashree runs micro enterprises from their home itself. So I could see how they are running this micro enterprises, and at the same time managing the responsibilities at home. I could also interview their husbands, their children. I could also see the interactions they are having, between each other. And I also changed the questions that I asked them. I asked them about their daily routines. I asked them, about their work. So all of these things gave me a much more contextualized understanding of women belonging to a middle-aged group from a different kind of socioeconomic background, especially working in relation to a participatory program like Kudumbashree. So so this experience has really enriched me to understand the importance of context. And at the same time, like you, the question about how I handle then the challenges about incorporating methods like ethnography and all of that, and finding validity for such methods, that was again challenging when doing research from the discipline of psychology. That was one challenge that I'm still trying to understand how to link my research to the discipline of psychology, when bringing this marginalized voice, which is because I'm like looking at how women exercise their agency without directly confronting the patriarchal structures, which is not very similar to the dominant narratives of or liberal secular feminist perspective. So when I try to bring in these contextualized perspectives from this women's point of view, locating it in the socio-cultural context they belong to, that is becoming more and more challenging in terms of methodologically, and in terms of like Professor Johri said, to bring in certain linear arguments and findings, and there is very less room for contradictions and conflicting narratives. Yeah. So that was my experience of understanding the importance of context in this.
Shuba, I wonder if I can ask you about if the absence of certainty, if the possibilities of contradictions and tensions is something that is routine, you think, for the work, the type of work you do, and also because you are, or you present yourself as an interdisciplinary scholar. So does that in a way help you deal with these things?
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. So yes, definitely. I mean, I would say that in my work, the starting point, the starting assumption often is about, the endeavor to highlight a variety of, pluralistic perspectives and voices. So, and I connect with what, both of my co-panelists are saying. So, like Rachna highlighted the importance of, maybe highlighting more subdued voices, less heard, marginalized kinds of voices. So given that, the starting point for me, a starting assumption theoretically is, and my work is already framed in post-structuralist, ideas about the, existence of multiple, perspectives and voices, and trying to sort of, highlight that complexity rather than homogenizing the findings. I think it is complexity, contradictions is something which is something which is a fairly routine matter in terms of the actual findings and engaging with the data, right? And that is where I feel that it has been really helpful to draw outside of the discipline of psychology, to look at other disciplines which I think have a much longer and much more careful history of actually engaging with multiple perspectives. My own turn towards anthropology really started with my with my doctoral research on women's experiences around possession and trance in the context of healing shrines, which at the time I was doing it, I mean, was research was fairly, there was a huge body of literature in anthropology, looking at trance, looking at possession, and so on. There was some work in cultural psychology, there was some work in the Indian context, but not a lot of it was really highlighting, and I was looking largely at women's experiences, uh, uh, given the fact that, in the Indian context, much of the, population in many of the religious shrines, a lot of them are women. So even though there was a wealth of literature, not a lot of it was really highlighting what do the women actually, talk about and what do they feel. And there was also a very strong strand of, exoticizing, these kinds of spaces and voices, and, romanticizing, them, coming from a, certain, framework. And so my attempt was a much more, grounded kind of field work, and it was also to sort of contemporize, the results and contextualize them. But in the, in order to actually even begin to engage with the topic, it was really important to look outside of, psychology as well.
Right.
And that is where I drew from other disciplines.
Right.
So for me, the experience really has been that qualitative research is, often used in the Indian context, and it is often assumed or taken for granted that any kind of, qualitative psychology research is inherently critical. But I have found it important to sort of, demonstrate that, criticality through the kinds of, theoretical, perspectives, really. So, so for instance, and again, interdisciplinarity is also something which has become such a fashionable buzzword, and especially we are in the context of, liberal arts, spaces, and working in let's say, departments which are, already sort of, my own department is a liberal arts department, and Rachna mentioned, working in a very already a non-conforming kind of, university. So interdisciplinarity is something which is, frequently touted, but often more by way of rhetoric rather than, practice. And what I have really found is that interdisciplinarity is often um, uh, in terms of, methods, frequently one sort of, turns to other disciplines. But when it comes to, critical and qualitative research in psychology in India, there is still a hesitation to actually look outside of the discipline for, theoretical learnings. And that has really been the sort of, challenge. So for instance, as I mean, at the very sort of, at the very practical level, having to field off questions such as, having to define in what ways does one's work actually, constitute as psychological, quote unquote. This is a frequent experience. And, like Rachna mentioned, I've also often experienced my work to find better resonance with let's say anthropology or disability studies, or even medical humanities, right? Rather than psychology, where the sort of central focus or intention often seems to be to try to prove the psychological nature of that research. And in some ways, I think that endeavor really prevents one from really understanding the issues in question itself. And for me, because my own attempt has been again to highlight people's agency and subjectivity, again I feel that issues of agency, the emphasis on practice, right, is something which other disciplines have again have a much longer history of engaging with. And I think perhaps psychology really needs to rethink, the understanding of, agency, and that would be a really important sort of contribution.
Right. I mean, no, that's very, very fascinating and extremely interesting. And I had kind of outlined two main topics that we thought we could discuss, and which are of very pressing interest for not only us, but I'm assuming for a lot of people here. But I was going to leave the one I'm going to ask now for later, but I think given the discussion, I think I have to talk about this first. So, Okay, so a lot of people would say that sociology is an exporting discipline. And sociology, for example, exports concepts and knowledge, right? Other disciplines absorb them and use them. And I think there's a lot of evidence to say that psychologists in, working in different fields and different times and different contexts have borrowed concepts from sociology. So I guess my question, or the thing that I'm thinking about as well, and I think that's something that I think all of us have something to say about it here, is do we see psychology as an importing discipline? Do we see a scope for psychology also to be, or do we also see psychology as an exporting discipline? And if it is the case that psychology is more of an importing than exporting, what can we do to make it into a more exporting discipline where we export findings and we export knowledge, whatever the findings may look like, right? And this knowledge is then used by the disciplines than the other way around, which is us being more importing. But it is an open question. So Rachna, if you want to go first, please do. Deji, if you want to go, please.
Well, I can try. I mean, I'm afraid I'm going to come from a position of saying that after all these years, a part of me really wonders why we need these disciplinary boundaries, right? And also because I come from a school which actually, I mean, my school is called the School of Human Studies at the Ambedkar University, right? And what we have there is gender studies, disability studies, and psychosocial studies hanging in together in the same school. And the idea of the school is to actually ask questions about the human from, raise epistemological questions about the human from positions which have been basically kept off center, right? So disability, gender, and in fact, because a lot of our work is clinical, the question of madness and mental illness and so on and so forth, right? So I am actually very fascinated by the vision of the very school that we set up, right? And it makes me wonder whether we need, because you see, you also have these new emerging disciplines like gender studies, childhood studies, madness studies, and so on and so forth, right? Age, and which are actually providing us with a new vantage point towards the idea of disciplines. So this is something that I'd also feel that we need to think about, right? After all, sociology and psychology are also disciplines which emerged 150 years ago at a particular historical juncture. So I think the emergence of disciplines and the need for boundaries is something that we need to rethink, although I do believe that the power that psychology has, right? And particularly in the contemporary world, to name, measure, in fact, to actually produce the human subject, not just to actually understand or uncover aspects. I mean, I don't see ourselves as giving up our power very quickly, right? So that's a slightly, off-center answer to the question. I do think we import more, but I think that is because we really don't have enough concepts to make ourselves relevant when we go outside a very limited kind of formulation of the psychological, right? We need to be able to export more, but in order to do that, we will have to rethink our discipline, I think, right? I must say one thing though in favor of psychology, because my kind of psychology, as I did say, I have been trained in somewhat, learned from the psychoanalytical tradition also. That is a capacity for very close listening to the human subject. I think that is something where we are often stronger, right? And to look at the affective world. But I think we've taken less ownership of that than we could have as a discipline.
Right.
So that's what I'd like to say.
Thanks.
Right.
Shuba, Deji, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so in my own experiences of studying gender, what I realized is that the more I try to understand the larger context in which people share this experience or their narratives exist, the more I try to understand the context, that is when my study became more interdisciplinary. It was not predetermined that I would be, drawing from these disciplines, but it is through the process I had to, integrate studies and concepts and theories from other disciplines in order to understand it in that, within that context. So I would also agree with Professor Johri on that, I feel that in order to understand it, thoroughly, or from a holistic, in order to have a holistic understanding, I felt, especially for topics on topics like gender, it was important to draw from other disciplines as well. And also I study from a liberal arts department, so I equally had exposure to other disciplines through weekly seminars and through my discussions with my peers. So it was very fascinating for me. And I did my graduation and post-graduation from a psychology department, but I really liked the experience of studying in an interdisciplinary department and also doing an interdisciplinary research, especially studying topics like gender. Yeah, that's it.
Shuba, did you want to say something on?
Yeah, so just very quickly, in the interest of time, I mean, my predominant experience really with regard to, this question of either exporting or importing has been of, a phenomenal lack of dialogue really between psychology and other, disciplines, despite the fact that, for instance, quite often, questions that are engaged in are, very similar. So even, for instance, there is this rich body of literature, let's say, in the anthropology of mental health, which looks at, experiences around altered subjectivity or altered states or, madness in very very different ways, and yet there is very little engagement typically in psychology with such disciplines. So and I mean, with regard to your point about exporting or importing, I actually want to play sort of devil's advocate and argue that I think that is less of the question or the concern, or that should be less of the question or the concern, but the engagement with the material, with the field, should really sort of guide one's work. And quite often these disciplinary labels are really used, they're used discursively, they're used also practically to sort of define one's work in certain ways. So for instance, given that many of us who do qualitative research in India are find oneself having to sort of justify and explain one's approach, the use of labels such as critical psychology often works to somehow validate one's work, and in a sense, I mean, that is where I've found that the use of interdisciplinary labels, like let's say disability studies, for instance, uh, helps to sort of discipline these, I mean, these are already interdisciplinary fields, right? If we think of gender studies, disability studies, they're already disciplinary. So drawing on that helps in many ways to really validate one's work. But I personally think that I'm less invested really in the question about exporting versus importing. But yeah.
Fair. And yeah, I mean, and I think what was really fascinating, of course, is the common thread that maybe we don't need these boundaries, but that's we won't go into that just now. But I think what was interesting there was Rachna was saying about how psychology has the potential, the duty, let's say, in some ways, right, to produce a subject, to produce what is agency, to produce this idea of what is a human being. Now, of course, I would love to talk about that more, especially hear what you have to say. But I think we have under 15 minutes, so I wonder if we can open this discussion to others and see if you have any questions. We have a comment from, please forgive me if I'm pronouncing the name wrong, Bola Udegbe. And the comment is like, your presentations are raising a lot of issues that I can relate with. The export-import dimension probably depends on, to some considerable extent, on how much one gets engaged, multi-interdisciplinary and collaborative research. So I wonder if Bola, you wanted to say something about that, or if you just wanted to say that and nothing more.
Yes, I just wanted to make that point because you raised a lot of issues, like I said, I could relate with. For instance, my department, psychology, was the last to come into the Faculty of the Social Sciences in my university. So our offices are kind of interspersed, you know, almost everywhere in the faculty. And so my office is with sociologists. And I do more work with sociologists than I do with my psychology colleagues, you know, and even I would say more work with people who are not even in my faculty, with people in medicine, people in in Faculty of Arts, you know, and all that. So I just found, you know, the discussion about the, you know, how much of whether we think, because it's making me actually think through all this. I find that we tend to be very, in my part of the world, we tend to, the psychologists tend to like kind of be insular and, you know, act like silos, you know, everything we do, we try to do within psychology. And for that reason, and then we tell ourselves we're just professionals, that other people are not as professionals as we are. So that kind of restricts how much we work with other people and how much we can actually engage with, you know, introducing different kinds of methodologies into our work.
Right, right,
you know,
right.
So I just wanted to share that, and many other things that, even some of the things you talked about, Rachna, I can also relate with, because I do a lot of studies and research on gender and leadership. And that's one of the reasons why I find that I'm working with sociologists, I'm working with historians and stuff like that. So, and I find that the literature that I need to be able to relate, I mean, to discuss these things are beyond even with my discipline. Because, I mean, again, I mean, that's why I was fascinated with the discussions about Latin America, about Asia, and we tend to like kind of import a lot of the theories. And those are some of the things that my colleagues in the humanities and I are looking at right now, that how do we begin to interrogate the rich amount of data that we have in Africa, for instance, in our daily lived experiences, to make sense of what, you know, we are seeing every time, instead of just importing the theories and seeing and just doing confirmatory studies. You know, look at the studies, you're just confirming whether they're consistent with what you find in your culture, when the data in your culture is actually speaking to you and you can see the theories there. You know, so I mean, that's why I said I can relate with a lot of the things they're talking about. And trying to do feminist research and working with other groups kind of exposed me to qualitative research. We don't teach qualitative research in my department. In fact, if you're talking qualitative, it's like you're not serious. You can't have so much rigor and everything like that. You have to keep looking for how to validate, you know, your study, you know. But because, like I was saying yesterday, I said the fact that you're versatile, you're able to do both qualitative and quantitative, gives credence to what you're talking about. It's not like you're escaping. I mean, that's the way they look at it. It's not like you're escaping. It's like, this is the better way to look at this question you're trying to study.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Bola, for those thoughts. There's another comment here from Beth, and I think it's directed to Deji. So Deji, do you want to speak to that? Can you see the comments?
Yeah. So thank you, Beth. I think it is equally important to understand, like you said, especially for topics like gender, because it is intertwined with the socio-cultural fabrics of the society, and in order to understand it, I am in many ways pushed to draw from other disciplines. And the challenge in doing that is the challenge in terms of validating your research, or linking your research, especially when it is a PhD work. And the challenge would be to link this to the discipline of psychology, and also finding validation for using ethnographic methods. So all of that thing, I think, is extremely important. And as a person who loves to do research and very much interested in gender, my effort to draw from other, or my decision to draw from other disciplines is also coming from a genuine like for doing research, the way it is unfolding. Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Zach, did you want to say something about your comment? Zach,
I think I kind of tried to sum it up, but going off a little bit of what Daji said, I think you can use gender as an example, and it just makes me wonder, because gender is studied, and I think largely usefully, practically in many different disciplines, sociology, anthropology, psychology, gender studies, but it makes me wonder what would happen if, and I think in all these disciplines, a kind of unique idiosyncratic language and a set of terms develop, which is unique to kind of each discipline, somewhat separated. And I wonder what our knowledge would look like if those terms were and languages were less separated and more on the same page.
I mean, just to give my 2 cents on that, I think it would make teaching disciplines a very tricky task. But I'll let others speak to that point as well about the language issues, for example.
Can I butt in?
Of course.
I'm just very enthused about the whole approach that was presented here in the last 40-50 minutes. And I'm not surprised now. I was, but I'm not surprised, because I think you all understand yourself much more committed to an ethnographic approach. And I think that's where, now my question is, I mean, would you go so far as psychologists and argue that the unit of analysis is not the person anymore, but it is the context? This is what I found myself writing recently. And and this is an interesting phrase, I found myself writing. Yeah, but I think this is where I am right now, to make this point to psychologists, that we have this holy cow, or whatever we call it, which is the person, the isolated, etc. We can go on. But if we shift it to the context, I think that's exactly, where newness, new findings, or it's not findings, but new venues of inquiry and realizations about how people function in context come to existence. So I'm very enthusiastic about what I've been hearing in the last 50 minutes. So I thank you very much.
Can I quickly respond to that?
I would say yeah, Shuba, you start.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for that, Michael. And I think it's a really exciting proposition. Something which would, sit very happily with me. I would say that, quite often our understanding has been about, even in the way in which our language is constructed, right? We speak of person and context as if, there is a possibility really of a separation, and, that idea of, of this individual sort of, unit, which can be sort of, separated from these, larger, ever expanding, circles of, context that, we sort of imagine, is again something which has been, questioned in, a lot of work on, culture and personhood. And the idea that when one talks about person, it already has to be sort of understood in a contextualized way. So yeah, I mean, I think that idea really resonates with with my own approach, wherein it's always been an attempt to to emphasize and articulate what subjectivity, in a contextualized kind of frame really is about. I'm going to pause and let Rachna come in here.
I might complicate this right at the end of this discussion, and maybe that's not a great idea. But the thing is, I'm a little resistant myself to the reason I like subjectivity as a concept as opposed to personhood is because I think it engages with both ends equally. And the fact that the subject is potentially resistant to the normative is, I think, an important idea I would like to hold on to, because otherwise we also lose the critical edge, which, maybe we can get by remembering that. And because I have been somewhat influenced by psychoanalysis, I always say that the inner and the outer are mutually constituted, right? And also that this whole idea of desire, of something that is beyond what the social world makes us be, right, is maybe, even if it's not true, I think it's a very useful frame to retain in order to be able to listen to that something which is outside what would be completely socially, sort of constructed or whatever. So it's a complex question though, but for me, retaining something of that which, responds to the social, but is not completely constituted of it, is a valuable thing. Or rather, if at all it is constituted, there are so many contradictions in the social that there is something that emerges which becomes, also personal, is what I'm saying, right? Like, I mean, there's so many contradictions in the way mother love is defined, for example, in the culture, or what it means to be a woman is right now, that there is something that emerges, which is not a replication really of so you can't go away from the context, but you can't lose the person completely either. That's what my understanding is. Yeah. So I think you just can't get away from either, is what I'd like to say. Yeah.
If I just can add, I mean, these are exactly the kinds of discussions that I have with my, well, we are friends. It's Mark Freeman, and Mark and I, we discuss these two sides, and I think this is something that needs to be discussed further. Perfect.
Thanks, Michael. That's exactly what I was going to say. These things are, these discussions will continue to happen. And I think what will be interesting is how people working in different contexts on different topics will bring in their own ideas about it. Because I think if you're working on issues of marginalization, your idea of the role of person in the context is very different to if you're working on some other topic. So I think that also has an influence on how we conceptualize these things. So, I mean, we've come to the end of the session. There's 2 minutes left. So I think that's pretty much the end of it. And I want to thank all the participants here, and especially want to thank the main participants here, because it's 1:30 a.m. right now in India. So that is an enormous amount of commitment that they've shown, and I'm grateful, and I'm sure all of us here have really enjoyed these things. I think Michael wants to say something here.
Right. I hope you're not going to bed yet, because at 8 o'clock, at 7 o'clock, we have our social hour. All right, I'm kidding, but Zach and I will definitely have to stay up, and we will be there. But we'll extend our greetings from you from this session. Thank you, Rahul.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks everybody for this opportunity and for making the discussion a wonderful and fascinating discussion.
Thank you everyone.